All right. And we are back live. I'm pretty sure I have the right day. It's an A day, period 1A. I logged on and I didn't see anybody because usually it tells me how many people are in the live chat, and I'm like, where's everybody? Oh, I just walked away from the computer and I walked back and it says 4 people now. I'm like, oh, hey, everybody. What would you be so kind as to leave me a comment in that chat from the records? That'd be fantastic, if you would. I'm going to get started in a little bit. I do have a video to start off with, short 5-minute video to kind of go over with you simply because well, not simply because, but I want to wait a little bit simply because I want to give people more of an opportunity to get into the live stream, which would be fantastic if they would, So we'll get that thing moving. And then after said video, I would like to continue with what we've been doing with weighted voting systems. This whole first unit is all about voting systems. Obviously, you're working on your projects, which are on the 4 main voting systems that we have learned thus far. And then, of course, we're going to be jumping into weighted voting systems, which that's what we started last class. So, yay! I only see 1 comment so far. Make sure that you are leaving that comment if you were here and be like, hey, Mr. Markey, yes, of course, we're here on a Wednesday. We're so excited. We're jumping up and down. We're like, yes, get this thing moving. And we'll see what happens. Woo! And then we high-five each other. Or probably just me. I don't know. Anyway, so the video that I have, I love these YouTube videos that go, they're like TED Talks, but they're like shortened TED Talks or something like that. They're like TED Ed videos or some junk like that. They're like short things, like 5-6 minute videos, just kind of going over a topic in like a really cool animated kind of way. And that's what I have to kind of start off this class period with. Now, the video, I actually found it this past summer. They made it on the TED Ed videos made it this past summer, but I completely forgot to show it when we went over that first unit. But I wanted to show it here, and I wanted to have a brief discussion as to the ending of it, but we'll get there when we get there. So I see 2 comments now. Oh. Well, I'll remind you guys again to leave those comments in due time. But again, stalling a little bit simply to give people an opportunity to get into the live stream. I know they're all waking up. They're getting their coffee together. I haven't even had my coffee yet. Probably should boil my water for that. But I'm going to put my coffee together. It'll be great. So let me get this video queued up. I already have it loaded on the computer. I want to get the microphone next to the speakers. And we'll get this thing rolling. And then after said video, well, you'll see what we do next. Let's see what we got here. Come on, you. Duplicate. There we go. Much better. Okay, make sure the volume's up. And here we go. So like I said, brief video, and then I will begin the lesson that I want to begin.
Imagine we want to build a new spaceport at one of 4 recently settled Martian bases and are holding a vote to determine its location. Of the 100 colonists on Mars, 42 live on West Base, 26 on North Base, 15 on South Base, and 17 on East Base. For our purposes, let's assume that everyone prefers the spaceport to be as close to their base as possible and will vote accordingly. What is the fairest way to conduct that vote? The most straightforward solution would be to just let each individual cast a single ballot and choose the location with the most votes. This is known as plurality voting, or first past the post. In this case, West Base wins easily, since it has more residents than any other. And yet, most colonists would consider this the worst result, given how far it is from everyone else. So, is plurality vote really the fairest method? What if we tried a system like instant runoff voting, which accounts for the full range of people's preferences rather than just their top choices? Here's how it would work. First, voters rank each of the options from 1 to 4, and we compare their top picks. South receives the fewest votes for first place, so it's eliminated. Its 15 votes get allocated to those voters' second choice, East Base, giving it a total of 32. We then compare top preferences and cut the last place option again. This time, North Base is eliminated. Its residents' second choice would have been South Base, but since that's already gone, the votes go to their third choice. That gives East 58 votes over West's 42, making it the winner. But this doesn't seem fair either. Not only did East start out in second to last place, but a majority ranked it among their two least preferred options. Instead of using rankings, we could try voting in multiple rounds, with the top two winners proceeding to a separate runoff. Normally, this would mean West and North winning the first round, and North winning the second. But the residents of East Base realize that while they don't have the votes to win, they can still skew the results in their favor. In the first round, they vote for South Base instead of their own, successfully keeping North from advancing. Thanks to this tactical voting by East Base residents, South wins the second round easily, despite being the least populated. Can a system be called fair and good if it incentivizes lying about your preferences? Maybe what we need to do is let voters express a preference in every possible head-to-head matchup. This is known as the Condorcet method. Consider one matchup, West versus North. All 100 colonists vote on their preference between the two, so that's West's 42 versus the 58 from North, South, and East, who would all prefer North. Now, do the same for the other 5 matchups. The victor will be whichever base wins the most times. Here, North wins 3, and South wins 2. These are indeed the two most central locations, and North has the advantage of not being anyone's least preferred choice. So, does that make the Condorcet method an ideal voting system in general? Not necessarily. Consider an election with 3 candidates. If voters prefer A over B and B over C, but prefer C over A, this method fails to select a winner. Over the decades, researchers and statisticians have come up with dozens of intricate ways of conducting and counting votes, and some have even been put into practice. But whichever one you choose, it's possible to imagine it delivering an unfair result. It turns out that our intuitive concept of fairness actually contains a number of assumptions that may contradict each other. It doesn't seem fair for some voters to have more influence than others, but nor does it seem fair to simply ignore minority preferences or encourage people to game the system. In fact, mathematical proofs have shown that for any election with more than 2 options, it's impossible to design a voting system that doesn't violate at least some theoretically desirable criteria. So while we often think of democracy as a simple matter of counting votes, it's also worth considering who benefits from the different ways of counting them. The United States' use of the Electoral College to elect presidents instead of the popular vote has become increasingly contentious in recent years. How exactly does this system work? And is it fair or antiquated? Find out here.
So, yeah, that last little part is a little bit of an advertisement for a different video that they have on the Electoral College. Now, we have talked briefly about the Electoral College and what that voting system has in store for it. But the Electoral College, for the most part, is more along the lines of a weighted voting system. And the reason why the Electoral College is a weighted voting system is because typically most of the states, in fact, every single voting block except for Maine and Nebraska, vote as a unit. So California, when the 55 electoral votes go out for California, they all go to one candidate. When the 14 electoral votes from New Jersey go out, they all go to one candidate. Yeah. So a couple of reminders, because I see that the number of people have increased. If you haven't left a comment, make sure you leave a comment. Number 2, you do have a project due tomorrow. Lots of people have emailed me about that, getting their topics approved and whatnot. Make sure that if you haven't contacted me about that you do so that we can get this thing done in an appropriate amount of time. Anyway, so this thing actually, he didn't call it Condorcet. I think Condorcet or something like that. Condorcet or what? I don't know. It's French, so who cares? I care. But the video just goes to show that no matter what you do, there's always an unfairness principle involved. There's always some level of unfairness, no matter what the voting system that you end up doing. So I just like the animation on that whole thing. I wish I had shown that earlier. But today we focus again on weighted voting systems. Like I said, the Electoral College is probably the most famous weighted voting system that you are aware of. But I want to talk a bit more about that. So let's go to it. Now, typically, weighted voting systems, if you go outside of the Electoral College, they really focus in on like very specific scenarios where a certain group of people decide to vote together as like a little voting block, like the Electoral College. And thus we can kind of predict what potentially could happen if they decide to vote together. Let me give you a good example of which, and then we'll kind of deep dive this thing a little bit. So I'm going to call this Weighted Voting Systems Continued. If I can find, where is my marker? Did I throw it in a fit of rage? I might have. All right, let's get another one. Here we go. Today is the 17th. There we go. And I'm calling this Weighted Voting Systems Continued because we started this last time. Last time, we talked about just what a weighted voting system would look like, what kind of notation they would typically use. The individuals voting are the players. We talked about the quota. Talked about a dictator, things of that nature, coalitions. But, we'll talk about an example right here. So let's just see what we got here. Here we go. Here's just a very basic example that I'm going to kind of dive into and just to review and refresh with you what the heck is going on here. So typically, there we go. Typically, a weighted voting system is going to have this type of notation in which that first number represents the quota. It represents the number of votes needed in order to pass any motion. There are, according to this notation, 3 players that are voting. Player 1, player 2, and player 3, the ones that I just pointed to. Now, player 1 and player 2 and player 3 have, in this case, a different weight of votes. Doesn't have to be a different weight. You could have 2 players have the same weight. Doesn't matter. But they have to vote together in a coalition in order to meet the criteria, to meet the minimum number of votes. There are certain coalitions that would absolutely pass a motion. For example, player 1 and player 2 could vote together. Done and done. In fact, player 1 and player 3 could vote together. Oh, happy day. Unfortunately, players 2 and 3 cannot pass anything on their own because players 2 and 3 do not meet the quota when you put them together. Different little things like that. We're going to get into those details. In fact, let me talk about the winning coalitions here. A winning coalition in this case, I can actually list these out because we did this last time. A winning coalition is a group of players that would meet the minimum criteria for the quota, which is 6 votes, 6 or more. Let's see. The winning coalition in this case, you could have player 1 and player 2. Because together, player 1 and player 2, and notice the little notation that I use here for player 1 and player 2. They usually do like a P and then a little subscript number. But player 1 and player 2 would meet that criteria. Player 1 and player 3 would meet that criteria. Unfortunately, players 2 and 3 would not. But there is one more winning coalition, which would be all 3 players voting together, all 3. That counts as a winning coalition. In fact, for some of the things that I have prepared for you today, for a little bit later on, for some of the things that I have, you're going to need to list out winning coalitions and all possible winning coalitions, depending on the situation that's at hand. Now, just a couple of pieces of information. First of all, the quota. The quota must be more than 50% of the total votes available. So just for the sake of argument, again, notation, the total votes available in this case would be 8. The total votes available in this case would be 8, because 5 plus 2 plus 1, that would be the weights of the individual players. The minimum quota. What's the minimum quota? Well, in this case, the minimum quota has to be more than 50%. If it is 50%, there is the possibility of a tie. And in this case, it could be, well, actually, in this case, you can't have a total of 4, but the minimum quota has to be more than 50%. The minimum quota has to be 5. Now, in this case, that's not what the quota is. If it was, then we would have a completely different ball game in terms of winning coalitions. What's the maximum quota? Last class, I talked about how you could have more than 50% be the quota, or it could be up to 100%. The maximum quota in this case could be 8. And you could make that, if this were your voting system, you could make that quota 8 if it was your system to design. And if it were, in this instance, if the quota were 8, then you would have to have a unanimous vote in order to pass anything. Even though everybody weighs differently, you need everybody's vote. It's essentially, it's like the weights don't matter in that case. If the quota were 8. Okay. Let me double check one thing. Last class, I'm just double checking the notes that I gave you last class to make sure I gave you certain definitions. I know that I talked about a dictator and I talked about a dummy. Let me give you an example of a voting system that has a dictator and a voting system that has a dummy. So actually, let's start with the dummy. So, example of a dummy. When people form a company, the founders of the company are typically on the board of directors. And the power that those people hold, the weight of their vote, depends, let's say, on how much money they put into it. For example, if I were to start, Apple with my best friend back in the 1970s, If I were to start Apple and I put in $90,000 to start this company, and my friend put in $10,000 to start this company, I put in 90,000, he put in 10,000. Perhaps I wouldn't think it's fair that he would have an equal vote as me, or something along those lines. So in that instance, to start off, my weight, the weight of my vote should weigh a bit more, in my opinion. Here's an example. So there's a company that people put money in to start, and they decide that, okay, if you put in, for every $1,000 that you put in, that's a vote for you. So this one guy puts in $10,000, another guy puts in $10,000, another guy puts in $10,000, and then the last guy's like, oh, I can't actually meet the $10,000, so he can only put in $9,000. It's like, okay, that's fine. This is an appropriate voting system, though. It is. The quota is 30. There are 4 players. There's only one winning coalition, though. Oh, no, there's actually technically 2 winning coalitions, to be fair. You could have a winning coalition. I'll put win coal. Win coal. You could have a coalition of player 1, player 2, player 3. Or you could have a winning coalition of player 1, player 2, player 3, and player 4. They could all vote together because they would meet that criteria. However, this is where we really have to recognize this. Player 4 isn't needed. Player 4 isn't needed. There is no scenario in which player 4 is actually needed to pass a motion or to meet the quota. By the definition that I gave you last time, and hold on, I'll read you the definition that I wrote down last time. A player that never has a say in the outcome. A dummy is a player that never has a say in the outcome of a vote. By definition, player 4 is a dummy. Might as well not even exist in this particular system of voting. It's very strange. But that's what ends up happening with it. All right. Let me show you what a dictator would be. Sorry, every time it gets me. Okay, there's a good one of a dictator. Okay. Now we're going to get into the details of the amount of power that you typically have in a voting system, but we'll get into those details in a little bit. Let's talk about an example of a dictator. Now, one basic example of a dictator is, well, there's only one player, and that player meets the quota. Yeah, of course. That's a very easy way of recognizing a dictator. But you could have a dictator in a non-political way. You could have by definition, in voting systems, you could have a dictator if there was one person that could pass whatever they wanted and no one could stop them. So, for example, here's a good example of one. The quota is 8. Here we go. And there's only 3 players in this case. The definition that I gave you last time for a dictator, was if a player's weight is greater than or equal to the quota. And in this instance, yeah. Remember, the quota has to be greater than 50% of the total votes. Altogether, there are 14 votes available. So at a bare minimum, with 14 votes available, the quota has to be 8 because you have to have more than 50%. Well, player one can pretty much pass or not pass whatever they want. They are greater than or equal to the quota. Yeah. So, I mean, you could talk about winning coalitions, but in reality, players 2 and 3 are not even needed. Player 1 is a dictator. And by definition, players 2 and 3 are dummies. That is the technical term that goes along with them. It's very strange. I know. It's one of those crazy things. Now, we could fix this. We could fix this dictatorship. We absolutely could. We could fix this dictatorship in one fell swoop. Fix the dictatorship by increasing the quota. You can fix the dictatorship by increasing this quota. So, for example, if we made the quota 9, now, not a dictator. Move that up a little bit. There we go. We can fix the dictatorship by increasing the quota. If we make the quota now 9, now player 1's no longer a dictator. They cannot pass anything on their own. In fact, by moving up the quota to 9, now you give power back to players 2 and 3. This word power means something huge with what I am going to show you. The use of the word power is not a mistake or a coincidence. There is a certain level of power that people have in voting systems. If you're in a dictatorship like the one that we saw up top here, then all of the power, 100% of the power, lies with the dictator. But you can alter the system ever so slightly, which we did by increasing the quota. I mean, you could also take away a voting vote power, I guess, or a weight away from the person, but that's not necessarily fair. It's much more fair to kind of agree, okay, we're going to change the quota instead of change the amount of votes you have. But by increasing that quota to 9, now a little bit of that power is given back to players 2 and 3. I shouldn't say a little bit. It's actually a bit more. Anyway, here's a definition for you. Something that actually plays into what our government is about. Veto power. You all have heard what a veto is. Now, keep in mind, technically speaking, a dictator automatically has veto power. But let's talk about that in a minute. This is the definition from a non-dictator position. If a motion cannot pass unless a certain player votes in favor, then that player has veto power. If a motion cannot pass unless a certain player votes in favor, then that player has veto power. Now, just walking around a little bit, talking about our government. Our government, the U.S. government, is set up on a system of checks and balances. And one of those checks and balances is the veto. So the way that it typically works when it comes to passing a bill or a law that affects the rest of us, typically it either starts typically through the House. There's a bill that goes through the House and they have to pass that, and they pass it. Good. And then the Senate votes on it and they pass it. Good. Okay. But then it gets to the president. And the president can choose to either sign the bill into law or veto. The veto is a powerful option that the president holds. Now, again, our U.S. government doesn't end there. The president can't just say no, and then the bill's gone, because Congress, the House and Senate, does have things in place where they could override a veto. And then the Supreme Court then determines whether or not it's constitutional or not. But, the law, it's a very interesting system of checks and balances, making sure that one person or one group of people don't have more power than the next. So that one person or one group of people can't run roughshod over the rest of them. It's a very interesting system. So we're talking about a veto power. A motion cannot pass unless a certain player votes in favor, then that player has veto power. So for example, if I go back to this one right here, 9851, there we go. If I go back to that example, the one where he's not a dictator anymore, player one has veto power. Player one has veto power because, players 2 and 3 can't pass anything by themselves. Even if players 2 and 3 voted in favor to pass something, player one could be like, no. Yes, a dictator always has veto power. But just because you have veto power does not make you a dictator. It's the square rectangle argument all over again. Let me go back to that corporate boardroom thing where they invested money. Different example. There's the quota. And there are 4 players. We did this example earlier. We talked about how player 4 was a dummy. Now, the interesting thing is, in this example right here where player 1 has veto power, there are no dummies. I want to specify that. In this example right here, there are no dummies. Because player 1 and 3 could go off on their own and pass something, and players 1 and 2 can go off on their own and pass something. Each player does have a role to play in passing something, and they're necessary. They actually play a role in it. Whereas in this example down below, players 1, 2, and 3 have veto power. Move that up. There we go. Players 1, 2, and 3 all have veto power. They don't need player 4. We declared that player 4 was a dummy in this example. And yes, they are. They totally are a dummy. But then players 1, 2, and 3 all have a power of 10, and they all are needed. They are all needed to either pass or not pass whatever motion is at hand. So you could have more than one person have veto power. It's a very strange notion. It's a very strange notion. Okay. I need to do one major thing to wrap up today. And again, before I start this major thing, just a reminder, I see the 4 comments so far. If you haven't left a comment, make sure you leave a comment. And your projects are due tomorrow. Make sure you're emailing me if you haven't emailed me. But the one major thing I have to show you today is called the Banzaf power system. Sounds like an infomercial for like an energy bar or some junk like that, or an exercise routine. Actually, power system is probably not the right word. I believe power index is what the technical term for it. But I digress. I have to introduce to you the Banzhaf power index. Now, to do that, I want to show you the Icelandic voting system. Now, I would show you the American voting system, but I think it's more fun, whatever, don't care. I think it's funner to show you the Icelandic voting system. The reason why I do that is this. In most instances, in American politics, let's say we were to talk about the U.S. Senate right now, big talking point in the news. In the U.S. Senate right now, and you can check me on this, there are 50 Republicans. There are technically 48 Democrats, and there are 2 independents. But those 2 independents are said to, quote, caucus with the Democrats, meaning essentially it's 50-50. 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. And in the event of a tie in the U.S. Senate, the tie-breaking vote is cast by the president of the Senate, who happens to be right now Kamala Harris, the vice president. Now, those 50 Republicans typically, and those 50 Democrats typically vote together as a group. I say typically because obviously they just went through an impeachment vote where several Republicans broke off, but that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about Icelandic politics. In Icelandic politics, it's very similar. Icelandic voting system. They actually have 3 main political parties. I can't pronounce the names of these political parties because it's in Icelandic, which is more of a Slavic language. But the way that the voting system works is like this. There it is. You know, what's interesting is the fact that I can say, hey, this is how the voting system works. And I could write something like that. And you immediately recognize, okay, there are 3 players. Let's just assume that they are the political parties. There are 101 votes needed in order to pass anything. And let me see here. 99 plus 98 plus 3, there are 200 votes available. So 200 votes available. And if you notice, the quota is 101. Because if there are 200 votes available, 50% would be 100, but the quota has to be more than that. So it's 101. Okay. Let's define, before I get to Banzhaf, because I need to define this, a critical player. A critical player. This is mighty important. A player is critical if a coalition, I should say winning, if a winning coalition must have that player to win. Basically, remove that player and they drop below the quota. A player is critical if a winning coalition must have that player to win. Basically, if you remove that player and they drop below the quota. If that's the case, if they drop below the quota, then they needed that player to win. They needed that player to pass the motion. They needed that player to meet the quota. And I want to talk about critical players in regards to this Icelandic voting system. Iceland. So let's first talk about winning coalitions within this Icelandic voting system. They need to meet 101 votes. Well, right off the bat, if you have players 1, 2, and 3, you have 200 votes. If you have players 1, 2, and 3, you have 200 votes. Who is critical? Well, the thing is, remember, it's 99, 98, and 3. That is the system that we have in place. In fact, I'll put it up here. 99, 98, and 3. That's the system that we have right there. Well, if you remove player 1, yeah, they have 101 votes. Okay. Well, if you remove player 2, they have 102 votes. Oh. Well, what if you remove player 3? If you remove player 3, they have 197 votes. None of them are critical. None of them. Absolutely none of them. Okay, all right. I'll play your game. Different coalition. Player 1 and player 3. Player 1 and player 3, if they vote together, 99 and 3, you get 102 votes, which passes a motion. Good for them. Who's critical? Well, if you remove player 1, clearly, you can't pass anything with 3 votes. But if you remove player 3, you also can't pass anything. So technically, both of them are critical. Again, the definition of being a critical player. You look at a winning coalition. Sorry, let's just say 3 right there. There we go. You look at a winning coalition, and if you remove that player and they drop below the quota, then that player is critical. You can also have player 1 and player 2. Player 1 and player 2. If player 1 and player 2 voted together, you would have 197 votes. But if one of them dropped out, if one of them was removed, but you wouldn't have the votes. In this instance, both of them are critical. This is all leading up to Banzhaf. All of this is unbelievably important in terms of understanding the Banzhaf power index. Finally, you can actually pass something with players 2 and 3. You would have 101 votes right on the dot, and both of them are critical. Basically, you need that player in order to meet the quota. Okay. Now, what we've actually just proven here is this. Number 1, there is no dictator. A dictator happens when you look at all the winning coalitions and the only critical player is just the one player, pretty much player 1. If only one person is critical the entire time, then they're a dictator. If you have a player that is critical none of the time, then that player, by definition, is a dummy. Looking at the critical players within those coalitions, looking at whether or not a player is critical, can determine whether or not you have a dictator or a dummy. And in this case, because more than one player was critical at any given time, there's no dictator. And since every player was critical at some point, there are no dummies. It's an interesting system, this Banzhaf power index. The other interesting thing is this Banzhaf power index, literally, this guy came up with this system like back in like the 1950s or 60s. Like, this is recent math. In fact, I'm looking at it right here. John Banzhaf first introduced the concept of Banzhaf power in 1965. This system that I'm teaching you right now is less than 60 years old. That's nuts. So, altogether, if you look at this critical column right here, there are, and watch me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 instances of a player being critical. 6 total instances of a player being critical. So, here is the Banzhaf power index. Banzhaf is spelled Banzhaf. Banzhaf. That is Banzhaf. The Banzhaf power index basically comes down to this. The power a player holds is the ratio of the number of times being critical. I can spell that today. Over the total number of critical events. I'm going to repeat that, and then we're going to calculate it for this system. The Banzhaf power index, basically the power a player holds, is the ratio is just a fraction, the ratio of the number of times being critical over the total number of critical events. Now, what does that mean for our system that we just did above for the Icelandic voting system? Well, for the Icelandic voting system, as I said, there were 6 incidents or 6 events of a critical player, 6 total. And we figured that out in the critical column. You can count up, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 6 instances. If we want to talk about the power that, let's say, player 1 holds, player 1 has the most number of votes. But player 1 was only critical 2 of those times. In fact, I can move this up a little bit. Player 1 was only critical 2 out of 6 times. Which, that's just 33%. Or 33.3%, I should say. Huh. Well, what about player 2? Player 2 was critical 2 of those times. And again, I go back to this critical column right here. I figure out when they're critical according to the winning coalitions. There were 6 instances of players being critical. 2 of those times, player 1 was critical. 2 of those times, player 2 was critical. And 2 of those times, player 3 was critical. Hopefully you know where this is going. But in this instance, player 2 was critical 2 out of 6 times. And player 3 was critical 2 out of 6 times. Now, remember the original voting system. The original voting system was this. The way that that voting system is set up, even though player 1 and player 2 far outweigh player 3, even though player 1 and player 2 far outweigh player 3, player 3 has the same amount of power. Same amount of power. The exact same amount of power. There are instances of that in, let's say, like the US government. Again, if you actually had like a true or third party senator, let's say, if you had a third party senator, you could have like 49 Democrats, you could have 48 Republicans, and you could have 3 third party, I don't know, the Green Party. I don't know what third parties are out there. Libertarians. And because of that, even though the Republicans and Democrats would far outweigh the third party senators, if they all voted their own way, those third party senators would have the same level of power if you needed more than 50% in order to pass anything. And in this Icelandic system, they have the same level of power. Now, it's interesting because, yes, there are 100 senators, and I mentioned in the U.S. Senate, and I mentioned, there are 50 Republicans, and technically there are 50 Democrats because of the 2 independents. And if there is a tie, you can't leave it at a tie. There has to be a tiebreaker, and that tiebreaker ends up being the Vice President of the United States, because they know things have to be fair and balanced. I mean, they're trying as best they can, obviously. It's a system that's been in play for over 250 years. So, wait, 250? Have we hit 250 yet? I don't think we've hit 250 yet. Hold on. I mean, because technically 1776 is when we declared our independence. Not 245. Wow, we're almost at 250. My word. Anywho. Now, that isn't to say that every system I show you is going to be something like this. Obviously, like I said, if you are a dictator, then you will have 100% of the power. In fact, if you're a dummy, you will hold 0% of the power. You can determine dictators and dummies based on the Banzhaf Power Index. It's actually a really nice system. This is what we're going to continue with next time. I'm going to have some examples for you via PDF that you could potentially fill out and figure things out in terms of organizing the Banzhaf Power Index. I'm going to wrap it up here. Again, I see the 4 comments. I see 7 people, but I see the 4 comments. If you have not left a comment in the chat, please make sure that you do so. That would be phenomenal and fantastic. Please. In the meantime, you do have a project due. Email me if you haven't already in regards to the topic, and email me if you have any questions. In the meantime, I am going to be signing off. See, I see you there. Anyway, I am going to be signing off. I lost my train of thought just because I wanted to gloat for a moment, but anyway. Here's one thing you got to know about the Banzhaf Power Index in Marky's classroom. As some of you may know, this is not a democracy within my classroom. This is, I could call it a number of things, but so far my favorite has been a democracy. That's been my favorite. Not to call it a democracy, but a democracy. Clearly, that is an amazing statement. And right now, you all are just floored by hearing that. I can understand. I mean, we all just voted on it, so I know that you're all floored on it. But anyway, I'm going to sign off. You all have a great morning. And we'll see you on Friday. Friday. Wonderful. Okay, bye-bye.